Hello and welcome. My name is Sally Bloom. I'm an educator here at the North Carolina Museum of History. I'm glad you could join us today for our live streaming event. A few housekeeping details to begin with. Remember, you can type in questions and comments on our YouTube page during the event, and we'll try to get to those questions later. And if the stream happens to drop while we're going through this, just hang tight. It'll come back up in just a few minutes. I'm really glad you can be with us today in the story of North Carolina, our 20,000 square foot exhibit that tells a chronological history of our state. Today you're going to meet some people and see some of the stuff of all of our history that focuses on African American life and culture in North Carolina. And to share some of those stories and introduce you to some of those people, I want you to meet Michelle Lanier. Michelle is the Executive Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. Michelle, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, I want to talk about how exciting it is to come to a space like this and to be able to welcome you all here because we can travel back in time. And this is February, Black History Month, although I celebrate Black History every day, all year long, every month. What do you think about, or what do you think you all think about when you think about Black history?
Yeah, turn to your neighbor for a minute and name some of the people or events you think about for Black History Month. What do you think they're thinking of?
I think when people hear the phrase Black History or Black History Month, they think about Martin Luther King, maybe Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass.
Mm-hmm.
And
those are great things.
A very painful part of our history, slavery.
Yeah.
And so we're going to learn about so much more than that today.
Right. We're just going to hear about some North Carolinians who help tell all of our stories. And I want you to introduce some of the people you know about.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So we can go back in time. People of African descent have been in North Carolina since the 1500s, which is way before I knew when I was your age. Some of those people were actually a part of the early explorers who were coming over on ships to find out about this land that was strange to them. And some were actually brought in ships. They were owned and kidnapped, and they were used for their labor to enrich others. And while that can be a very painful story, it's actually a very inspiring story to hear about how they survived and how their culture survived with them. I want to show you a few things. This basket right here might not be very impressive to you, but it actually has an extremely important story of cultural survival. The people who made this basket knew how to gather grasses, how to pull together pine straw, and how to sew together and weave together the basket so that it would hold so many things, including rice. The people of African descent who made these baskets may have come from tribes in West and Central Africa, tribes like the Igbo and the Yoruba and the Ewe. And even though they were brought and sometimes really, really mistreated and taken away from their loved ones, they didn't lose their skills and the African genius that they carried deep within them that became a part of the story of what my friend Earl, who you're going to meet later, calls the American genius. Let me show you something else here. This wooden object is actually called a mortar. This mortar is a part of a West African tradition of grinding food so that it can be preserved and prepared. And this tradition of taking wood and creating a mortar also came as a brilliant technique that the enslaved African Americans used. Behind the mortar, you will see that there are people who are dressed. They are in the United States at this time, one of the colonies. One of them is playing an instrument. I wonder what that instrument, do you think that instrument is called? Any guesses? We know it today as the banjo. And the banjo, we think of maybe with country music or folk music. It actually comes from an African instrument. So many things that we think of as a part of the American tradition came with enslaved Africans, cultural retentions and survivals with them. There were people like John Chavis who wasn't enslaved. He was a free man of color, and we'll learn more about them. He fought in the Revolutionary War. And there were people like Harriet Jacobs. Sally's gonna bring a picture of Harriet Jacobs over. Harriet Jacobs is one of my heroes. She was born in slavery, but over time became less and less comfortable living in bondage and decided to take the very brave step, not only to run, but to hide. She hid in an attic for almost 7 years, 6 years and 11 months. And when she came down one day from the attic, her grandmother helped her to get a boat ride up to a free state. And after the end of slavery, she came back and she helped her people to learn. So we're going to learn more about the history of Africans and African Americans in North Carolina, people like Harriet Jacobs and John Chavis.
Excellent. So I want you to come along with us and meet some of the other people from North Carolina that help tell all of our stories. And Michelle, you have a personal connection to this person, right?
Yeah, so this person, you've heard us talk about free people of color, that not everyone was enslaved who was of African descent here in North Carolina. And there's a man that we're going to learn about named Thomas Day, and he was a woodworker, an artisan, a very talented one. And my aunt Grace Lanier Thompson, she and some of her sisters in her sisterhood were very wise, and they knew the importance, the historical significance of Thomas Day. Can you say Thomas Day?
Thomas Day.
Thomas Day. So they knew, Aunt Grace and her sisters knew that his furniture was so important that they gathered together a large collection. These African American women gathered together a large collection in the 1970s. And they said, we're going to donate it to the state of North Carolina. And it's the largest collection of Thomas Day's furniture that has ever been donated to the state. Many of those furnishings are right here in this building. We're going to hear more about that.
Yeah, let's see some of them. And I want to introduce you to Earl Imes, who's a curator here at the museum. Earl, what can you tell us about Thomas Day?
Well, thank you. Thomas Day is one of my heroes. Thomas Day is a free man of color who is born in Virginia. He's called Free Issue. And Free Issue means that his mother, Mourning Stewart Day, and his father, John Day Sr., were also free during the 1700s. So Thomas Day and his family migrated from Virginia into North Carolina in the early 1800s, and he moved and settled into Milton in Caswell County, which is on the Virginia border. And by 1850, Thomas Day had the largest cabinet maker and furniture shop in the state of North Carolina. He actually controlled almost 17% of all the business in the state of North Carolina. He is one of my heroes both for his perseverance and his ingenuity. He actually had an assembly line going on in his shop in the 1830s in Milton, where he employed free people of color, enslaved artisans, as well as white artisans. And some of those white artisans left and later served and taught people cabinet making in places like Old Salem, in my hometown in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So Thomas Day and many free people of color lived in North Carolina and in fact comprised one of the largest populations of free people of color in the state. And as Michelle mentioned, you'll see we have the Thomas Day washstand and mirror, veneered with mahogany, onlaid with marble top, exquisite. And this is one of more than 50 items in our collection that we have not only on exhibit here at the Museum of History, but they've also been exhibit at the Renwick Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., and seen all over the world.
Wow.
So an African American man made this in the 1800s?
Yes, a free man of color, Thomas Day. And Thomas Day was more of a brand, so people in his shop produced under his apprenticeship. And as his part of his apprenticeship, they were able to use the Thomas Day brand. So some of those people produced Thomas Day furniture who were free people of color, who were enslaved, and who were also white under the Thomas Day brand.
So tell us more about these free people of color in North Carolina in this time period.
Well, free people of color comprised about 10% of the population of black people, 90% being enslaved. But the free people of color were divided into two issues. As I mentioned, Thomas Day is free issue, meaning his mother and father were both free. And then you have freed people who were freed from slavery, someone like Lunsford Lane here in Raleigh, who actually developed plug tobacco and became fairly wealthy by taking secondhand tobacco, combining it with molasses and placing it for tobacco chew. And that became a popular industry in North Carolina later in the 1800s.
Terrific. So what happened to end this time period that we're talking about?
Well, the laws concerning free people of color and slavery in general began to strengthen and tighten, and it became so tight that the whole society erupted into a great civil war. And North Carolina was a Confederate state among the last states to join the 11 Confederate states in May of 1861. And here in North Carolina, we have not only a large contingency of Confederate soldiers, but also the formation of the United States Colored Troops, or what started out as the African Brigade after Abraham Lincoln issued what is called the Emancipation Proclamation. Can you say Emancipation Proclamation? That is when the course of the Civil War was changed to include freedom for everyone and to outlaw slavery, which eventually resulted from the Civil War. And some of the effects of freedom were enacted by the United States Colored Troops. And this is an example of an identification tag of Private John Gaskell, who served in the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry that was later converted in 1864 into the 35th United States Colored Troops.
You mean this is a dog tag?
This would later become a dog tag.
This is what they
You're
call
right.
it. Okay.
These are the first so-called dog tags. The United States Army had not employed dog tags before the recruitment
this?
of the United States Colored Troops. So there were generals who were with the United States Colored Troops who ordered these identification badges for their troopers. And in this particular case, John Gaskell from Washington, North Carolina, which is the original Washington, formed in 1783, before our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. was formed in 1792. At the age of 54, John Gaskell enlisted and fought for his freedom and helped to save the Union and outlaw slavery for everyone in our country.
Do you think this guy would have had one of those?
Well, these two guys would have part of it. The guy on the left is a man named Parker D. Robbins. He's a staff sergeant in the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry, and he is from Hertford County, North Carolina, and his regiment was at Richmond at the end of the war. And this man was freed from slavery. He embodied the Emancipation Proclamation by seeking freedom and leaving his plantation in Washington County, North Carolina, near Plymouth, North Carolina, and he swam over 3 rivers to get from Plymouth, North Carolina, to a place called James City, just outside of New Bern, where the United States Colored Troops were being recruited for action to help save the Union during the Civil War. So Private Luke Martin later lived in New Bern, and he died in 1920, 3 years after his youngest son, Mr. Luke Martin Jr., was born in 1917.
That's pretty amazing. So after the Civil War, slavery ended, so was everything just terrific for African Americans in our state at that time?
No, there was a lot of upheaval. There were a lot of questions about how African Americans were going to become integrated into society. People who had never had any control over their lives suddenly were able to decide where they could live, how many children they wanted to have, who they could marry. For some, it meant sharecropping right on the plantation where their ancestors were held in bondage. And for some, there was a whole unleashing of liberty that they fought very hard for the right to marry those that they love and have children and to create a home, for the right to be educated. Enslaved people, it was illegal at certain points in our history, it was illegal for enslaved people to be taught to read. So Shaw University was founded on the brink of freedom, on the dawning of freedom after the Civil War, the oldest historically black university in the South. We also,
And it was also founded literally while Raleigh was under Union occupation at the end of the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, Raleigh was the site just west of a place called Bennett Place where the Confederate Army surrendered its largest number of troops. And in that time frame, in April and May of 1865, is when the oldest historically black college and university in the South is founded right here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Shaw University.
and there's someone I want to introduce you all to, who at that same time that my friend Earl was referencing, she entered another historically black college. At the time, it was called St. Augustine's Normal School. It's now St. Augustine's University. Anna Julia Cooper was a brilliant, ingenious woman. Even as a child, she was so smart that she was used as a tutor to teach adults how to read, and she fought for the right to learn what at that time was called the boys' course, math and Latin. She went on, born in slavery, she went on to get her doctorate degree from the Sorbonne in Paris and educated many along the way, becoming what we call one of our early black feminist thinkers of the nation, the only woman quoted in the American passport, her thoughts on freedom. Can you say Anna Julia Cooper? Anna Julia Cooper. Let's meet some other people. Let's go this way and learn. Earl, would you talk to us a little bit about some of the other changes that are happening in terms of the politics of the time?
Sure. Well, the state of North Carolina passed the laws that allowed for black men to vote in 1868. And so beginning in 1868, the first black legislators were elected and served in the state capitol in Raleigh. And between 1868 and 1901, more than 125 black legislators served in the state capitol here in Raleigh, and there were 4 black congressional members who served in Washington, D.C. in the United States Capitol. A 5th, Mr. John Frank Baker, unfortunately did not serve because he was assassinated at the railroad depot in Goldsboro, North Carolina. But among the more successful are a man named George Henry White, born in Tar Heel, North Carolina, just on the North and South Carolina line in 1852. And he literally rose from slavery, was raised by a free person of color in southeastern North Carolina, was educated, and eventually earned a law degree from Howard University, an HBCU located in Washington, D.C. And he returned to North Carolina where he served as a lawyer and a politician, and he was the last black politician to serve in the United States during the Reconstruction, leaving office in 1901.
And the reason why we can say he was the last is he gave a very famous speech, so famous that there are awards named for this speech. It's called the Phoenix. If you've ever heard of the mythical bird, the phoenix, that rises up out of the dust, rises up out of ashes, even though there was something happening where African Americans who had been experiencing freedom, those freedoms started to be stripped away again. Their freedom started to be burned down to ash. But he predicted, George Henry White predicted, that out of those ashes, the Negro, the African Americans would rise again.
And along that line, President Obama quoted and alluded to George H. White in his 2008 presidential inaugural address, where he claims to rise from the ashes for the black politicians.
And so what happens during this time period where African Americans are struggling to maintain rights, equality, a better life for themselves and their family? What happens while we are waiting and fighting for equal access to the vote again? Well, I'll tell you what happens is African Americans create a whole society. Segregation. Blacks enter one entrance, whites enter another. Blacks being told that they have to sit in the back of the bus. I'm sure you've heard of the story of Rosa Parks. Well, there are others who fought against those injustices. And one way that people in Durham, North Carolina fought was to create what we call an oasis space, a whole Black community, so vibrant, so successful, so smart, so culturally sophisticated that scholars from around the country, including W.E.B. Du Bois, called it Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was anchored by North Carolina Central University and the oldest and largest Black-owned insurance company in the world, founded in 1898, North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance. And my papa, my great-grandfather, sold North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance. So Durham was extremely important, not just for North Carolina, but the entire world, because it showed that regardless of the unfairness of segregation and so much racial violence that African Americans faced and the intimidation, regardless of that, there could be communities where you could get anything you wanted. There were donut shops and hotels and theaters, and famous people from all over the country would even travel to places like Durham to perform and to stay and visit.
Michelle, that insurance company, is it still around?
It is still around, and so are some of the Black banks that were founded during that time, like Mechanics and Farmers.
Very good.
And so during that time period, although African Americans were not given equal access, they were still able to survive. They were making contributions to the military, and we had many people who were involved in every single war that our nation ever faced.
Absolutely. Here we're passing through an exhibit on part of our exhibit on World War I, and African Americans volunteered and were drafted and served in World War I, behind the lines, on the lines, nurses here at home, in spite of the tremendous segregation and other detriment to their rights at the time.
And after World War I, we go into the Great Depression.
And in fact, one of those World War I soldiers was an engineer from Asheville named Private Ernest B. McKissick, who served in Europe during World War I, and he returned home and set down roots and actually began a long lineage of public service here in North Carolina.
I want to stop here because I want Michelle to share with us, because this artwork here is astounding. What do you know about this?
So this is artwork. Some of us would call this folk art. This is by a self-taught artist. His name is Arliss Watford. And these are portraits. These are members of his family who he created wooden portraits of.
They're sharecropper emblems and sharecropper replications that were made in the 1980s of some of his ancestors who were sharecroppers in the early 1900s in Hertford County, North Carolina.
They're made out of wood. The men have on overalls and the woman has on an apron. The overalls tell us that the relationship to the land is still very strong. But there's also a story that these briefcases can tell us as well. A story that there's a yearning for more and maybe even a call to leave home so that your family can access more. The images of the pattern on this woman's apron is an echo of an earlier aesthetic, a very African aesthetic. You can go to Africa and see cloth that looks exactly like that. So even in this time period, people of African descent still had certain remembrances of their ancestors. But there was a call for more, a call to the Great Migration for so many to head north, to attain economic opportunities.
So the Great Migration refers to when a number of African Americans left the South for other parts of the United States where maybe segregation wasn't enforced as strictly, maybe where economic opportunities were more available. And I know this radio tells a story of one of those people. What can you share with us?
That's right. So one of the great musicians of our state is Thelonious Monk. Can you say that name? Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk. There are people all over the world who know and have been inspired by this jazz genius. He was born in rural Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which is actually in 2 counties. That's in Nash and Edgecombe. But he left with the Great Migration with his family and settled up north. Because of that movement up north, he was able to be exposed to many more opportunities. And that's one of the reasons that he's known all over the world. But he never forgot his North Carolina roots, his North Carolina musical heritage, and even the sounds of his community, where he could hear the railroad passing by taking tobacco. And the sound of that railroad, if you go and you look up Thelonious Monk's music, close your eyes and see if you can hear the sound of the railroad that passed by his house in Rocky Mount, North Carolina.
You can say Thelonious Monk, the melodious thunk.
All right, we have to stop because there's one of my favorite artifacts here.
Yes.
Let's talk about this. This is an artifact that comes from the World War II time period when over 69,000 African Americans from North Carolina served in World War II. I love this poster because it's so vibrant and so colorful. Michelle, what do you see about it?
Well, I want to draw your attention, if you will. We know that it's bright, so it's meant to draw our attention. It's in Raleigh, right where we are, and it's geared towards servicemen, and that means members of the Air Force and the Navy and the Army. But what else do we know? They're saying this is a place where we can find a place to hang your hat, but not all together. White men have to go to the Salisbury Street USO, and Negro men or African American men have to go to East Hargett. So we can see that even though all of these men were making sacrifices and even risking their lives for the nation, but they were not allowed to be together in social settings because of Jim Crow segregation based on race. But I have a beautiful story to share with you. Because of the space on Hargett Street, I'm here today. My grandfather, who volunteered in World War II to serve in Italy, met my grandmother at that USO on Hargett Street.
Wow, Michelle, I think you have a connection to many of our artifacts.
I
This
do.
is great. You know what? I think everybody has connections to the stuff around them. Our stuff tells our stories. This is great that yours are here at the museum.
Yes, and we're about to join Earl and hear about another serviceman who also has a World War II connection.
Earl, who have you got here?
Well, this is Private Floyd McKissick Sr., and Private Floyd McKissick Sr. is the son of the World War I veteran Ernest McKissick, who we just mentioned. And Floyd McKissick served in World War II in Europe during 1941 to 1945 time frame. And after the World War II, he emerged as one of the leading civil rights advocates in North Carolina and in the nation. Floyd McKissick took advantage of his GI Bill to obtain an education and earn a law degree from the University of North Carolina. And he was one of the first African Americans to earn a law degree at the University of North Carolina in the entire South. And using that power and that education, he was able to affect equality for all citizens, white, black, and Indian. And he also served and worked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And one of the lasting legacies that Floyd McKissick did is he established a town called Soul City, which is one of the first black towns in America established in Warren County. But you'll also like to know that the first black town incorporated by freed people is also here in North Carolina, and it's called Princeville, North Carolina. Can you say Princeville? Princeville was incorporated in 1885, and Floyd McKissick incorporated Soul City in 1977 as a community that exists in Warren County near the Virginia border.
So Mr. McKissick, was really involved in the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And were his actions for North Carolinians or for lots of people?
His actions were for everyone, because just like this sign says that they're white and colored, that you would have to by law go through your side, or if you went through this side, Sally, under the colored, you would have to face a fine and penalty and possibly jail. So you would have to go through the white side, and I would have to go through the colored side.
That, of
And
course,
that
makes
was
no
the law.
sense to us
It
today.
makes no sense, but this is what Floyd McKissick and Dr. Martin Luther King and students fought against, because what's important is that Floyd McKissick were adults. Martin Luther King, they were adults. But the effects of the civil rights movement was really enacted by students, by young people who didn't have a job to lose or who did not run the risk of having a cross burned in their yard by the Ku Klux Klan. So here is an example of an artifact that affected social change. This is a Woolworth lunch counter from Salisbury, North Carolina, which is an exact replica of the Woolworth lunch counter from Greensboro, North Carolina, where we have the famous sit-in of the North Carolina A&T students in February of 1960.
So I really want you all to understand how important student involvement is in terms of this social justice movement for freedom and equality for all, for fairness, regardless of race. We know about Martin Luther King, but now you know about Floyd McKissick, the only North Carolinian to speak at the March on Washington.
That's right.
You've heard Earl, my friend, talk about SCLC, which was Martin Luther King, he was the president of. Well, there were students also at Shaw University who a really amazing woman named Ella Baker was able to get together so that they could create their own organization. And that organization was called SNCC. Can you say SNCC? And SNCC, and it
SNCC.
stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was important nationally. The students who formed SNCC in the spring of 1960, just after the Greensboro sit-in, they went all over the country, very much inspired and supported by Ella Baker, who many call the godmother of the civil rights movement. And they fought for people to have the right to vote and for people to have fair access to everything, just like all people. And in fact, there were high school students who joined this freedom cause. So when we think about the Greensboro sit-ins, as Earl described at the Woolworths, we think about this brave group of 4 young men. And there were so many more than just 4. There were women from Bennett College for Women who were part of the strategic planning. They planned and they thought through how to create this protest moment. And they planned it with those men, and they joined them on the second day. And there were black and white men and women from across Greensboro. And when the college students went home, it didn't stop. High school students from historically black Dudley High School in Greensboro also joined the cause for this summer. So you too can be a part of a movement of history. It doesn't end with the 1960s. It doesn't end with the 1980s. It continues. You all can be a part of this rich history. That's for everyone, regardless of your race, regardless of whether you're black, Latino, or Asian. This African American history is your history.
And you can help form history today and history for tomorrow by collecting artifacts, just like these items that you've seen in the exhibits here, and documents, sometimes love letters from your parents or your grandparents, or letters from your uncles from World War II, or even photographs that show your ancestors at church or working on the farm or anywhere where you can get your information documented by your ancestors on your artifacts and documents and photos. And that is what becomes our history for tomorrow.
Yes, in addition to the artifacts or the stuff of history, ranging from your grandmother's cooking pot or an apron to your uncle's briefcase, to a diploma of someone who graduated from high school or college. You can also sit down and listen. The stories of our people are a beautiful way to add to our understanding of history of all of our communities. Every one of you can sit down every February and interview an African American member of your community, your neighborhood, your family. That would be a wonderful way for you to celebrate Black History Month. But don't let it stop there. You can celebrate all year long.
12 months a year.
That's right. So what they've been talking about just now are collecting and creating those primary sources, the actual stuff and stories of people who are living through history. You create primary sources all the time. Every email, every text, every homework assignment. Your shoes are primary sources. What stories do they tell about you, and what stories would they tell in the future? And I just want to reiterate some of the names. Let's rename some of the people we've met today from North Carolina. whose stories affected not only our history, but the history of everyone everywhere. We started with
John Chavis, who fought in the Revolutionary War as an African American man, and he was an educator and
Here in Raleigh.
Here in Raleigh, he was so well respected even during slavery times that he taught white and black students.
and he's on that worksheet that you have there that you can fill out. And then you mentioned
Harriet Jacobs, one of my most favorite people, who was brave enough to hide out from slavery for almost 7 years, and once she escaped by boat. And then she wrote her story in a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And she came back. She went from addict to activist. She came back and she helped to not only fight against slavery, but when slavery was over, to educate her people.
and then we went over and saw you, Earl, and who were you sharing with us?
We were talking about Thomas Day, the free man of color, who was a cabinet and furniture maker, in fact, the largest cabinet maker in the state of North Carolina on the eve of the Civil War. And he was born free. Both of his parents, mother and father, were free. We also learned about Lunsford Lane, a man who earned his freedom from slavery by creating plug tobacco and mixing it with molasses to produce chewing tobacco.
And then we went around the corner and we met that Union soldier, 2 of them in fact.
Yes, we learned about Private Staff Sergeant Parker David Robbins, who was a cavalry officer, and then we learned about Private Luke Martin, who served in the infantry.
Swam across 3
He
rivers.
swam across
to get
3
freedom.
rivers to earn his freedom and fight for freedom for everyone and to end slavery in the entire country.
And who had the coin, the little tag?
The dog tag, the early
Yes,
dog tag, before they were
yes.
dog tags.
Private John Gaskell, and John Gaskell was also a freed man. He earned his freedom and helped to save the Union at the age of 54, enlisted in the United States Army.
Wow.
Then we learned about some of our early black legislators and congressmen, people like George Henry White. Remember the Phoenix speech, really important story of our history that's nationally important. George Henry White.
And more than 125 other black legislators who served in Raleigh between 1868 and 1901. And there were 5 elected congressional members and 4 who actually served in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C.
So when you come to visit the state capitol in Raleigh, remember that there were African American men who, just as slavery ended, were becoming lawmakers. Then we learned about Anna Julia Cooper, known as an early black feminist who was born in slavery and ultimately got her doctorate degree at the Sorbonne in Paris, and is a remarkable scholar, someone who you can read her work to this day. She wrote A Voice from the South by a black woman of the South.
Then you introduced us to Floyd McKissick.
Floyd McKissick and his father, Ernest McKissick, both served in World War I. Private Ernest McKissick and Floyd McKissick Sr. served in World War II, both to serve for freedom and equality for everyone in our country and to come back and to affect civil rights and equality and voting rights for every American.
And we ended with
We ended with Ella Baker.
Right.
Ella Baker, one of the mothers of the civil rights movement. We talked about SNCC being founded at Shaw University and, of course, the Greensboro sit-ins. But I hope you will remember all of these figures and learn more, read more, and be curious.
We do have additional resources available for you on our website from the live streaming page. We'll put them on a link. When this event is over, it will be recorded and be available as a video on demand. But now I think we have time for some of your comments and your questions. We're going to hear from Chelsea, and we're going to repeat the question that she says, and then we'll see who can answer that. And we'll try to do brief answers so we can get as many as we can.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Chelsea. How are you
Chelsea.
guys? Thanks for the great presentation today. We currently have no questions yet. I think people are busy typing, so
Okay, well, hang
if
on.
you guys just want to
Hang on.
give us a couple more fun facts.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when you think about history after African American history in North Carolina after the Civil Rights Movement, what name or person pops into your mind first?
Well, certainly, I think about the importance of our black musical traditions in North Carolina. So if you haven't heard of this man named Maceo Parker, I want to introduce you to him.
One of my favorites.
Can you say Maceo?
Yes.
Maceo.
Maceo Parker, and he and his brother Melvin formulated a huge part of what we know as the James Brown sound. They were two brothers out of Kinston, North Carolina, that went to North Carolina A&T University, and Maceo Parker still tours to this day. He not only performed with James Brown, he performed with Prince and does an amazing solo act.
Wow.
Well, and along that line, their producer was Nathaniel Jones,
Yes.
who produced James Brown, also from Kinston. And Nathaniel Jones, we would call him the Quincy Jones of yesterday,
Awesome.
of the old-time segregated Chitlin circuit. And during this time frame, when there were audiences only for black or white, these musicians would say they would affect integration, because whites and blacks would want to come to their performances and integrate and willfully dance and participate. So you have people like that. I think another name that comes to mind today is Michael Jordan.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Important, yes.
I'm sorry, but I was in New Orleans when he made that shot and we won the national championship.
What?
I was there. But we have some questions.
Yes.
All right, we'll talk about my history later.
All right, guys. Our first question is from Oak Grove Elementary School. Do we know about how many enslaved people in North Carolina the Emancipation Proclamation impacted?
Yes, the Emancipation Proclamation impacted about 900,000 enslaved and free people of color in North Carolina. Now, our population of enslaved people was 334,000 enslaved people. And in North Carolina, that population was somewhat significant of a whole population of about 1 million, which included white, black, and Indian. So 1 million people were effectively free governed in slavery, but there were actually about 335,000 counted in the 1860 census who were actually enslaved in bondage.
And if you're a math person, if you think about the fact that our population was approximately 1 million and our enslaved population was approximately 300,000, that meant 1/3 of our population was enslaved. So that means if you look to your left and you look to the right, one of those people would have been enslaved. So it was a significant portion of our population.
Well, and leading along that line, it was concentrated primarily in eastern North Carolina too. So there were populations that were higher in concentration, so that you can have some counties that are actually majority enslaved counties in the eastern part of the state.
Wow, thank you. Our next question is from Meg. Who is your favorite African American from North Carolina and why?
Got to be brief, guys. You got a lot of questions.
Oh my
If
goodness.
you could only pick one. That's hard.
That is
Well,
very, very
I
hard.
have two. They're
Yes,
both women.
go ahead.
Polly Murray and Anna Cooper Haley.
Can I tell them about Polly Murray?
Quick.
Okay, Polly Murray is, I agree. I think today I'll choose Polly as my favorite. Polly Murray was raised in Durham, North Carolina. She was a founder of the National Organization of Women, first African American woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest. She was a law scholar as well as a poet, and she wrote what Thurgood Marshall called the Bible that he used to defend Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate schools. She was a phenomenal human being and was raised in Durham, North Carolina.
You can ever read her book, Proud Shoes. It's amazing.
Proud shoes, yes.
Well, I'm going to call up again Private Luke Martin. And Private Luke Martin embodies freedom to me. And not only that, but after the war, he laid down his sword and he became a preacher. And he built a church in New Bern, and he actually had a son who recently passed away at the age of 80 in 1917.
Wow.
80 years young, Private Luke Martin had Luke Martin Jr. And Luke Martin Jr. is one of my favorite people also, because he was a master brick mason and a master builder, and he helped to plan and to restore the rebuilding of historic Tryon Palace in New Bern, North Carolina in the 1940s and 50s.
Amazing.
So that lineage is one of my
Quite a-
favorite.
Quite connections from Civil War to
modern day.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay. What's next?
All right, our next question is that Woolworth lunch counter from the Greensboro sit-ins still around?
Yes, it is. And in fact, it's being preserved in a way that you can visit it in at least 2 different places. What a lot of people don't realize is that was a very big Woolworths. long counter and also other tables. So the original Warwick counter you can visit in Greensboro, North Carolina at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. I would highly encourage all of you to visit maybe more than once. There's also another place that has just a piece of the original counter, and that's at the new museum in Washington, D.C., the National Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And there's a gentleman who's alive today who's a renowned architect who lives in Durham, North Carolina, and went to North Carolina State University in Raleigh, named Phil Freelon, who was one of the lead architects on this internationally important museum. But there's two places you can visit the counter.
All right, our next question is from Danielle. Do we know about how Harriet Jacobs survived in the attic for 7 years?
Yes, she wrote about it in her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And there's also a scholar named Jean Fagan Yellen who wrote a book about her called Harriet Jacobs, A Life. And those two books will give you a lot of information. You can actually read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl for free at Documenting the American South at UNC Chapel Hill. And so it tells a lot about her story, but her grandmother, who had been enslaved, but attained her freedom late in her life, owned a bake shop. And it was in the attic of that bake shop of Molly Horniblow, her grandmother, that Harriet Jacobs hid. She was let down late at night, at least every 2 or 3 days, to stretch her limbs and to take food up. It was a very, very hard existence for her.
Well, and along that line, if you want to read the primary sources of incidents in the life of a slave girl, you can visit our North Carolina State Archives and research our Chowan County records and research those primary sources that you mentioned, Sally, that are so essential to our history.
All right, our next question is from Evie. What instrument did Thelonious Monk play?
The sax.
Actually, Thelonious Monk played the piano, and I think the reason why Earl is saying the sax is because there's another really famous musician we have not mentioned named John Coltrane who played the saxophone, but Thelonious Monk played the piano, and he would say things very interesting. He was a creative man. He said, I'm trying to find the sound between the keys. He was experimental and kind of in his own world when it came to music, but he definitely played the piano.
I think our next live streaming event needs to be about African American musicians.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I think we need to do that.
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right, our next question is from Molly from Trinity Academy. Do we know the names of any of the women who planned the Greensboro sit-ins?
Yes, in fact, one.
Putting you on the spot, Michelle.
Yes, one is Yvonne Johnson, who was the first African American woman to serve as mayor of Greensboro, and she was at Bennett at the time, and she was part of the planning of that. And then also at the time, the president of Bennett College for Women was named Dr. Willa Player, the first African American woman in the country to serve as president of a 4-year college. And she was an extreme supporter of the civil rights movement and of her students participating in the civil rights movement. Willa Player and Yvonne Johnson.
All right, Catherine would like to know, do we know an exact date when segregation ended in North Carolina?
Well, no, that is part of the reason that we have to continue history is because the laws like the 1964 Civil Rights Act ended the practice of segregation, but people actually doing it kept the customs, so that we have to have a heart and mind of equality to go along with those laws. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act is what ended legal segregation. But unfortunately, people still segregate and discriminate, and that is where we should practice our own personal self-convictions and our own conscience to make sure that we treat everyone equally and with respect.
That's what I mean when I say that you make history. All of you, each of you, whenever you make a choice and how you act or the words you choose, actions you take or don't take, you are making history, and it speaks to this as well.
Well, and too, along that line, there's a saying that we say that the laws produce customs. And here in North Carolina, as we mentioned, we used to be a slave state. In fact, we were a slave state for 200 years before the Civil War, and we had to unlearn those customs. And we've only been 150 years removed from being a slave state. So we have technically been a slave state longer than a free state, and we are still thereby unlearning those customs.
There's
and it's
still
a
more
continuous
work to do.
process. So there's a lot more work to do.
Yes.
All right, our next question is from Hannah. Her students would like to know if Luke Martin died during the war or if he lived to see the end of slavery.
Luke Martin died in 1920 in New Bern when he was over 85 years old. He was born in 1836, and when he died in 1920, he had remarried a second time and had a son in 1917, Luke Martin Jr., who lived up until January of 2015 in New Bern, and he passed away at the ripe young age of 97, and he was able to tell very good stories about how his father escaped slavery and searched for freedom and swam those three rivers in the winter of 1863. I mean, can you imagine right now in February swimming across the Neuse River? That has to have been an amazing experience, and it's all in search of freedom.
And he did live to enjoy a full life of freedom.
Yes, he did.
After all of his sacrifice.
Yes, he did.
All right, our next question is from Emerson. He wanted to know whether or not what the consequences would be if during the Jim Crow days, if someone walked through a white door or used a white facility.
It really depends. The consequences of disobeying the laws of segregation really depended upon who saw it, what community you were in, how strict that community was about segregation. So it really was not something that was extremely clear. It may even depended on what mood someone was in that day. And so the livelihoods, the quality of life of African Americans in that day, it was very much a precarious situation to go into those spaces where you had to really follow the rules, or if you chose not to, you were taking a great risk. I have some relatives who did choose to go into stores or sit at restaurants even when they weren't supposed to, and sometimes people would just ignore them, and sometimes they were thrown out. Sometimes you could be killed.
Yes, and sometimes, as Michelle mentioned, it depended on where you were. And here's a good example. Here in the city of Raleigh, a black man named Manasseh Polk, who was a Spanish-American war veteran, actually ran for mayor and voted in 1920 when it was against the law. But we currently have an exhibit on here at the museum called Selma to Montgomery, a March for the Right to Vote, photographs of Spider Martin, which took place in 1965 out in Alabama, and SNCC helped to initiate that March for the Right to Vote, those three marches in fact. But during those three marches, protesting for equality and protesting for the right to vote, three people, Jimmy Lee Jackson and Miss Viola Luza, a white lady from Detroit, Michigan, and Dr. Reverend James Rebb, a white clergy from Massachusetts, were all killed in 1965 simply protesting for equality and the right to vote. So it depended on interpretation. There were also laws, for example, that were not on the books that if I looked at certain people in a certain way, that could be counted as a criminal offense. And so sometimes I could be taken to jail, or sometimes I would just turn up missing.
Yes.
All right, our next question is, do you have a favorite African American artifact here at the museum or somewhere else that you'd like to share?
Oh, a favorite artifact. I think that my favorite artifact, there's a dress that's here that is receiving some much needed care. Some of the clothing from what we call the antebellum period or the pre-Civil War era, you can imagine it deteriorates with time. But there's a dress that's here that was made by an enslaved woman. And it really just touches me to think about a woman who was not fully acknowledged as a full human being, but clearly was able to leave a piece of herself. We don't quite know much about her. We may just have her name, but to know that we're here and that I'm living in freedom and that I am able to access so much more than she ever could dreamed of, it's very humbling, and it makes me feel both sad but also hopeful because of how far we have come. And it makes me very, very curious and determined to learn more about women like her.
Well, an artifact that comes to mind is one that explores the complexity of our history and African American history in particular. And there's an artifact that belonged to former Confederate President Jefferson Davis,
Okay.
which was actually presented by his widow, Miss Verena Davis, to President Davis's black bodyguard, a man named James Henry Jones, who served in the Confederacy as a Confederate bodyguard to the President of the Confederacy. And in 1893, when it was socially unacceptable, Verena Davis was making one of the first civil rights statements by presenting in public a cane of the former president. And this is very interesting because in 1893, it's a social faux pas for a black man to have a cane. You were to have a walking stick in public. So Verena Davis presents them to James Henry Jones. He's described as a Negro Indian from Warren County, who is a free man of color who was recruited and served as the bodyguard. And so this actual artifact was brought into the museum by none other than Colonel Fred Oles in 1914.
Who founded the museum?
Who founded the museum, and he actually got
1902.
the provenance from James Henry Jones at that time. And this goes to underscore the significance of 103 years ago. The information and the history of the provenance of that artifact was taken by James Henry Jones and Colonel Fred Oles and placed in our historical files, and we can tell that history today with that artifact.
I'm going to not pick one. I'm sorry, I can't. But I think that's all we're going to have time for. We'll try to answer one more. Chelsea says one more. Never mind.
We have one more question.
All right.
Do we know why February was picked for Black History Month?
Absolutely. The father of Black History Month is the renowned historian and educator Carter G. Woodson.
Yes.
And he actually first started the concept of Negro History Week or Black History Week, and it was because to honor the birth date of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And so then it just spread to Black History Month. And the people who keep that legacy alive are actually the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro that you can still read to this day. But that's how Black History Month started in February.
And Dr. Carter G. Woodson earned his doctorate degree from Harvard. He created Negro history, as Michelle said, in 1927 because of the misconceptions of the Jim Crow era that pervaded our society at that point. And he also alluded to the fact that it was February 1st that President Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment, and it's called National Freedom Day. And you'll recall earlier this month, Vice President Mike Pence also coined Freedom Day on February 1st to launch Black History Month. So February 1st is the date that President Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment and sent it out to the states. And here in North Carolina, our state ratified the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery in December of 1865. And 2 days later, the state of Georgia ratified the amendment and it became law outlawing slavery in the whole land.
Well, we're going to end with a special treat.
Yes, we're going to have to stop here. We'll try to get to the rest of your questions online later. Thank you so much for being with us today. We've got lots more stories to share, but we're going to end with John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. Incredible music. Thank you so much. Remember, every single day, with your choices, words, and actions, you make history too.